At a time when so many of us feel like our connections with people are distant and conversations are surface level, really engaging with each other takes intention. I'm Ashley Gould, the founder of Attend, an elevated, everyday home brand with products that set the table for meaningful spaces and gatherings. Our podcast builds on those spaces through dynamic discussions with open-hearted people, with the goal of sparking conversation around your table. From September through the end of the year, we'll be exploring one of the most universal and unspoken subjects, death and dying. Very few of us know how to prepare for, talk about, and support others through end of life. In this 8-part series, I interview guests whose personal lives and professions are intimately tied to the subject. Join me in an exploration of how to find more peace in preparing for death.
A quick note from the On the Table with Ashley team. This is part 1 of our 2-part episode with Steinberg, with part 2 coming out on November 6th. Enjoy.
Welcome to On the Table with Ashley, a podcast where I explore ways in which we can lead more fulfilling lives and amplify human connection by increasing our curiosity and communicating with less judgment and more respect. It's my pleasure to welcome Steinberg to On the Table with Ashley today. Play describes themselves as a visual and spiritual artist, using art to heal life and channeling wholeness out of separation and insight out of darkness. Play has worked extensively as a scribe or experienced artistic and visual storyteller, facilitator, and public listener, having worked for years in event production and grant writing and strategic planning in nonprofit organizations. Play received a BA in Film and Media Studies and Women's Studies from the University of Rochester and an MA in Deaf Cultural Studies from Gallaudet University. Play is also a Fulbright Scholar, student of Tibetan Buddhism, and now, I would say, Judaism as well. Play's current project is a webcomic titled Father.Mother.God. A webcomic or digital comic is a comic that is posted on the internet, often in serial form. Play's form of webcomic is a webtoon, which includes an infinite scroll where chapters scroll without page breaks. Father.Mother.God is a deeply personal autobiographical work being released in serial form. As of this recording, there are 5 chapters in the series that have been released. Because the webcomic is Play's current major project and because it is autobiographical, in this conversation, I'm going to introduce topics in the order we see them in the webcomic. Though, as you know, if you've listened to prior episodes, we may get off on a tangent and ultimately stray from the order of the webcomic as we go. Perhaps more than any of my prior guests, I don't feel Play can be defined by any of the accomplishments they have achieved. From what I've learned in researching for this episode, from listening to other podcasts they have participated in, to work they have done, Play seems to transcend accomplishments as ideals towards a larger goal of healing, understanding, and love. You can find Play on Instagram at Play Steinberg, LinkedIn at Play Steinberg, and webtoons.com, Father.Mother.God. I just go to Google and I search Father.Mother.God and it comes right up.
If you go to webtoons.com, you can do the same thing. But yeah, I do appreciate that it seems to pop up. I managed to get a good title, so
yeah, exactly.
It's searchable.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here.
So before we launch into a discussion in the order of your webcomic, I always like to start with a few foundational questions. And the first is hearing a little bit about your childhood, where you grew up, and what kind of kid you were.
All right. Well, I'm from New York. I was born in New York, in Brooklyn, at Maimonides Medical Center. And we lived around the city while I was small, in Brooklyn when I was a few months old, and then Queens, and then Long Island. And then when I was 9, we moved upstate. What was, I think, initially envisioned as upstate being Westchester County or someplace just outside the city somehow turned into moving all the way up into the Adirondack Mountains, about 4.5 hours outside the city. And I did the bulk of my growing up there. That transition was pretty rough socially, emotionally. I was lifted out of a really robust peer network and strong school district and diverse kind of community, and then put in some place where everybody was pretty much white, and the big city was Albany, and there was a lot of homophobia. Even before I knew what a gay person was, I was the target of homophobia. And I ended up leaving the public school system there after a few years and doing a year in Catholic school, and then going off to a boarding school for high school, an all-girls school in Troy, New York, where I did most of the rest of my high school career before going off to college in Rochester. In terms of what kind of kid I was, highly intelligent, highly sensitive, not so aware of how to handle people's impressions of me. I didn't make friends with the kids who didn't like me. Let's just put it that way. I wasn't the bridge builder then that I think I might be now.
And I understand music was a part of your life from a young age. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I started piano lessons when I was 5. That was, I think, both my parents' idea. My dad's side of the family was much more musical than my mom's, but my mom was very interested, especially then, at just getting me exposed to arts of all kinds. And so piano started then. And when I was, I think, in 4th or 5th grade, I was wanting to pick up another instrument. Oh, actually, even before then, I played viola in 3rd grade.
Oh,
and
wow.
then we moved, and then there was no longer an orchestra. There was just band. And so the choices, were completely different. And I chose the oboe as the instrument that I wanted to play, but I wasn't allowed to have the oboe yet. I had to wait till I was of band age. I don't remember if that was 5th grade or it might have been 7th grade. I skipped 6th grade, so that one doesn't count. But at any rate, I was told I could play the flute for a year. So I played flute for a year, just kind of waiting for my oboe chance. And then I started playing oboe, and I played that all through junior high and high school really, really diligently. I almost got a music scholarship to go to New York State Military Academy for high school, which I'm really glad my mother shielded me from that bad choice.
So I know music is still part of your life today. Is it singing or instruments, or what form is it taking?
It's a lot of singing. During COVID, I actually started playing my ukulele seriously, which is, oboe fell away after a certain point. Not having access to an orchestra to play in or a teacher to be studying under, and never having learned how to make my own reeds. There were kind of these obstacles to playing by myself that, and I just wouldn't have kept up the focus in college. College was kind of a no more splitting your focus 10,000 ways. You have to kind of pick a few points, and music was not what I went to school for. So then I have an ukulele, and I had it for a long time and wasn't playing it. And when the pandemic started, I saw this video that came out and kind of went viral on the internet that came out of Italy, because Italy shut down first. And one of the people in the video basically said, learn to play your guitar. No, seriously, you suck at it. Actually learn to play your guitar. And I went, you know what? He's right. We have a lot of time at home now, and I do sort of suck at the ukulele. I've got 3 chords and I don't really, do much with them. And somehow I just started writing songs. And so it was a singer-songwriter kind of deal. And I wrote songs, and that's how I learned, because I would write a song that I liked the sound of that was a little bit harder to play than what I could actually play. And then I would get good enough to play that song. These days, I'm also singing sporadically with a group called Sisters in Harmony, and we get together and we sing what you could call circle songs, rounds, or songs without any musical accompaniment. That is just a beautiful space to drop into. And this summer we're doing our singing outside. So we just sang outside next to the river the other night for a couple hours, and that was really healing.
That's amazing. It's funny because singing and music are also a big part of my family. So my dad played the guitar and wrote songs for family events, and my older sisters both play the guitar and have both written songs. And we sometimes sing in round as well, just as a family. and we would always sing in the car. Anyway, now it's more around the dinner table kind of thing. And there is something just cathartic about singing in around. I don't know why. It's probably been studied. But do you record the Sisters in Harmony or any of your ukulele songs? Like, could somebody find those online?
You could find some of my songs online on YouTube at Play Steinberg. I'm not necessarily advertising that fact, but they're there.
Okay.
There are a handful of them that are there.
Okay. So you said you kind of glossed over that you skipped 6th grade. You talked about how you're an intellectual, and just from your educational background, it's clear that you're a gifted student. So tell us about skipping 6th grade. And then I want to hear about how you decided to pursue an MA in Deaf Cultural Studies.
Okay, skipping 6th grade, socially, it sucked. It was miserable. It was the worst choice. There wasn't another option for what to do with a kid who was smart, and there weren't any advanced programs really. There had been one, and it wasn't sort of enough. And it was a kind of one day a week where they would take a few, I think maybe 3 of us out of the whole grade, and bring us to another school with a few select kids from other schools. And we had this little class of maybe 10 or 12 kids, and we would get a special curriculum for that one day. And that was really fun, but that was one day a week, and it did nothing for the rest of studies. And by the end of 5th grade, my classroom teacher just had me reorganizing all the books in the classroom and building a library and not even listening to the lessons. And so they said, why don't we skip you ahead to 7th grade? It'll be challenging that way. And I did a couple weeks tutoring over the summer in math, which wasn't enough, and then went into 7th grade, which is when I started getting really beat up in school because I was 11 years old and there were kids. So obviously I had not reached puberty. I was not shaving my legs. I was very much a child. And I'm in class with kids who are 13 or so years old who had maybe been held back a couple times and had extra years on me. So I was very much a target. Yeah. Okay, so that's enough on 6th grade. How I got to Gallaudet and the Master's in Deaf Studies. When I was an undergraduate, I was studying film. Film studies is different than film production. So it wasn't making films. I was kind of critiquing and analyzing and taking them apart and looking at them through a more visual and cultural studies lens, feminist theory and Marxist theory, and, all these different ways that we could take apart a film. And then the summer of before my senior year, an independent film project was being shot in Rochester, and they contacted our department looking for free labor, looking for production assistants. And I volunteered and jumped at the chance to be on a real film set and get to kind of be hands-on with what I'd been studying. And the lead actress of that film was a deaf woman named Taraline, and she and I made friends. Despite the language barrier, I got a hold of a few books and started trying to learn some signs out of books, which is pretty hard to do because books don't move. So you basically learn all the signs a little bit wrong and then try and use them, and it's really awkward. But it was enough that she could tell I was earnest, and we made this friendship and we stayed in touch. She was from LA, and that senior year I decided to take ASL. I said, I'm going to really stick with this. Why don't I take a couple semesters of sign language? So I took 2 terms of sign language, and I moved to Los Angeles to pursue a film career after I graduated. And she and I ended up very quickly working together on a theater project. She had pitched an idea to a festival. It was a festival of faith. It was all faith-based, original one-act plays. And they were hosting it over a number of weekends at different centers of faith around Los Angeles County. So one weekend it was at a Buddhist temple, and one weekend was at a synagogue, and ours was at a Baptist church. And so she'd been accepted to this festival. She'd pretty much cast the actors. She had, a date to go live she knew the weekend that they were going to be performing, and she hadn't written the script yet. And she said, will you help me write the script? And I said, sure. So in a probably a week or so, we wrote the script together for the show, and then we co-directed it together, and she was the lead and I was her voice, because it was dual performed in American Sign Language and English. So that got me kind of into her theater world. And then she had another show that was a one-woman show that was her own autobiographical work. And her set designer, I think, quit the week that before the show was going live. So instead of having a set design, she had nothing. And I kind of stepped into this gap and ended up doing the set design for her one-woman show, and then learning how to stage manage the show as a kind of backup stage manager, because the final closing weekend, the stage manager couldn't be there. And so I knew how to push the buttons. I knew how to run, I knew the theater really well. I knew how to run the house. The lights were all programmed. I just had to, say go and hit the cues at the right time. Well, that, of course, wasn't the end of it. She wanted to travel with the show, and she asked me to be the one crew member to travel with her. So then we would take a kind of minimal version of the set and source the rest of it on site wherever we were flying to. We were playing it at a lot of either deaf institutes, institutes for the deaf, which are deaf schools, residential deaf schools, or we'd be hosted by deaf women's advocacy organizations, because her show dealt with themes of sexual abuse. And so they would host us and bring the show. And I didn't know how to run lights if they hadn't already, been programmed. And I didn't know how to point them and aim them and focus them and run shows in houses I'd never been in before. But that's what I ended up doing. So we did that for a while. And I started really being introduced to this kind of area of the deaf world, which was either artists and performers, who are people that I love, or activists, who are people that I love. So it was these circles where I went, wow, these people are amazing. I have to do more with the deaf world. And Gallaudet had just started this deaf studies program the year before. I was in the second year of the program. And I had kind of said to myself, I'll never do a master's. I'm only ever going to do a PhD. There's no point in getting a non-terminal degree. This is a waste of time. And then I saw this program and I went, I don't know what I'm going to do with this in my life. And I don't know if it's even what I'm going to do with my life, but I have to go do this program. So I threw all my plans out the window about what I thought I would or wouldn't do. And I got accepted into the program, and then I went and did it.
So what did you learn in the program? And then I'm sure there has been a thread of this throughout your life and career. So I don't know if you've reflected on that recently, but can you share what you think that might be?
Well, one of the threads for sure is that in my time in the deaf worlds, both here in the US and in Ireland, which I think we're going to talk about in a minute, I learned how to think both visually and spatially, three-dimensionally, non-linear way. Sign languages aren't linear. They don't go from a capital letter to a period the way that written languages do. You can say things almost simultaneously depending on how skilled you are and how you're using space. You can build an environment and then make things move through it. And that, I think, has impacted the way that I listen to information in a huge, huge way, and impacted the way that I've been able to hone my skills as a scribe and graphic recorder, because I'm listening to a whole, and then from that looking for points of connection completely differently, I think, than if I'd never learned to think in sign languages.
That's so interesting. And as soon as you started talking, or even when you were talking about your experience with the deaf community, I was thinking about the scribe work that you've done in the visual landscapes that you create. What do you call it?
I call them maps a lot.
Maps. Okay.
Yeah.
So I've seen some of them, pictures of some of them that you've created, and we'll put a link in the show notes so people can see. So when you're listening, and I don't know how much of this you're doing now, and you might come back to it, but so I think that what you've done is somebody's speaking up on a stage, and you have a big sheet of paper or whatever it is that you're working with.
Foam core, cardboard or something.
Okay. And then so when you're thinking, you start with something you hear and then you leave space around it? Or does your brain even know what it's doing when you're doing it?
Okay, it really depends on the setting. So I'll give you a couple scenarios. If someone's on a stage, say it's a conference and the content is coming one way off a stage, I know the length of their talk. I know the topic of their talk, probably. Depending on the speaker, I may or may not have seen a deck of what they're doing, or seen the recording, or seen them before, or I might just really be going by the seat of my pants. But I'm going to try and keep up with the talk in terms of the speed at which I'm recording, so that by the time it's done, and then maybe there's a Q&A, I have a map that's basically finished. Because what'll happen with this map that's almost like a one-page summary instead of the 30-page slide deck or whatnot that they might have used, everyone's going to come up and want to take a picture and go, oh yeah, this is what just happened. So I want it to be as done as possible when the talk is done. If I'm in a workshop setting where people are in dialogue and collaborating with one another, then either as the facilitator or in concert with the facilitator, we'll determine what the objective is for the maps. And it might be different from one kind of piece of the agenda to the next, in terms of, is this just a capture? We'll call it like a capture of what's happening. Just get it down what everybody says so that we can reference it later. Or is there a facilitative role that the graphics are playing, where they're reflecting something back that's adding to the dialogue and the discourse that's taking place? At which point I might record less of every detail and more of the themes that are emerging. In some settings, I get to work at a more generative level of scribing, where I can wait even longer in terms of when I make that first mark on the page, and really listen for what's the undercurrents that might not even be spoken. And that's my favorite kind of work. So then I'm taking notes from earlier on, but not on my boards. I'll be writing the way I like to do it. A lot of people use Post-its or pencil or a notepad. I like to use these kind of clingy film, dry erase sheets that I can put up, kind of poster sized sheets. I can put them up on the boards I'm actually working on and scribble with dry erase markers and slide them out of the way. And then I get the info I want. I start making the kind of mapping the points that I think are landing it. And then I can just scoot them out of the way entirely and wait until I'm really clear on what's the image that's supposed to start driving this, or what's the kind of visual architecture and where do I begin? What point is the starting point? And that tends to come from a much more intuitive space. And those end up being the maps that people go, oh, this map says everything that we did this whole weekend. I did one recently at an event where there was a really high kind of density presentation with a lot of data from a set of researchers. And my point wasn't to scribe that because we had their data, but to kind of say, can you show a picture of what this means for the Jewish world? And the picture that I ended up drawing, everyone then went on a breakout session and I stayed in the main room, and I had about 45 minutes to kind of make this anchor image. And I ended up drawing a picture that had no words, which I've never, ever, ever done before, because scribing is usually a combination of words and pictures, sometimes even more word heavy. Right. And in this instance, I kind of went totally into this visual metaphor that occurred to me. And I resisted the urge to put any labels on it and just let people, we did a resonance practice where people then said what they saw in the image all out loud around the room. So it comes in all these different forms.
Yeah, that is so cool and so beautiful. So I was going to ask if you wanted to get back to that, but it sounds like you're still doing it even with the webcomic.
Oh yeah, I'm still doing it. Not as much, but I am still doing live work and custom work where people will say, have a board meeting and have, this giant memo that they want summed up in 3 images to present to the board. And then to be able to communicate out, here's what our mission is. And so I'll do projects like that, or illustrating podcast conversations also.
Oh, cool.
I have one client where I do illustrations of their podcasts. So it takes different forms.
And do you travel to do that work, or only sometimes?
less since the pandemic. It used to be constant. 2019, I was on a plane all the time, plane or a bus or going places all the time, almost never working locally. And now I do travel, but it's much more sporadic. I haven't gotten back into the swing of it, especially with the comic being my focus this year. I haven't been pursuing that work as much.
Right. Well, I hope you will do more and more of that because it's so cool. And we haven't talked about the artistic side of that. So we've talked about music and film studies and your work in the deaf community and your studies there, all of which I think help with that. But what about the artistic side, the drawing side? Where did you hone those skills?
I think I was always a drawer, if you can say that word. No one ever says that word.
You can say it.
We say drawer, but that's something else entirely. I drew a lot as a kid, and I did take some art classes when we still lived down in Long Island. I remember taking acrylic painting, and I remember taking pastel and charcoal drawing classes and kind of building up. I was gonna graduate from pastels to oil paints eventually, and then we moved upstate, and there weren't art classes anymore. So it was just art in schools. And I think the drawing that I did for myself mostly ended up being copying cartoon characters. I don't know how it happened, but my mom would give me these magazines that were basically catalogs of Disney animation cells for sale, individual cells. And so I would look at this cell and I would copy it perfectly. And then I would look at find another character who I liked and find the cell that I liked, and I would copy it perfectly. And I'm glad I did all that now, because right now with this comic, there's a lot of taking a photograph and then reproducing it, as realistically as I can to get an image to look compelling. And so it's a lot of that perspective and reproduction skill that's coming back. I mean, I guess I took an art class here or there in high school, but most of my high school art classes were weaving and photography. So a lot of it is just on the fly.
Yeah, mostly self-taught, some early classes.
Yeah.
And you really can tell in the webcomic, or at least I felt, and I didn't know, that some of them were photographs that you kind of made into a webcomic version. So it's interesting to hear that is the case.
I use a lot of photographs. Yeah. Even just to get the posture of my hand or something.
Yeah.
Interesting. I'll take a bunch of pictures and then work from those.
So I do want to hear just a few sentences about what you studied in an MA in Deaf Cultural Studies. I'm so interested.
Sure. Basically, it was cultural studies is, how do you sum it up? It's looking at what culture is and how it functions and how it works and what its component parts are. And then Deaf Cultural Studies is looking specifically at the deaf world. So it's kind of like the same way you would have women's studies, or you would have African American studies, or you would have any minority group. We're looking at the deaf universe. For instance, looking at what makes a deaf identity. There's a cultural identity, and then there's the fact that it is technically in today's society a disability. And so then you get into disability politics and disability theory, and what's the intersection between that and deaf identity and deaf studies, and whether deaf people want the label of disability or not. And yet, it's useful in some contexts and it's disabling in other contexts, culturally speaking. One way that you define kind of megaculture, not subculture, is that there's a language of its own. So when ASL was determined by William Stokey, a linguist in the 60s, to be an actual legitimate language, that was the beginning of the blossoming of deaf culture as a movement, where it wasn't just this subculture of people kind of ashamed of what their language or their deafness because of how they were schooled and how they were kind of taught and how they were perceived, but instead going, hey, yeah, this is a real language. And actually we have real linguistic art forms here, and ASL storytelling and ASL poetry are mediums that are totally different than media in other languages or other formats. So we did deaf history, and we did linguistics, and we did classes on kind of more social work elements, and we did the pedagogy kind of education, critical education studies, and it kind of ran the gamut of every element of cultural studies that you could imagine. And then we each had a thesis project to complete our master's, and for mine, I actually did make a film. Finally, I I think it's about 40 minutes long. I made a documentary that looked at the deaf visual cultural arts movement, its history, where it came from in kind of the 60s and so on. And then two deaf women artists who were really figureheads in that field, one kind of two different generations. That's called Paint It Loud. And that's also on my YouTube
Okay, good. I was
page.
going to
And
say, we
it
should
is captioned.
definitely.
After almost 20 years of it not being captioned, I finally got it captioned. So it's now accessible to hearing people.
That's great. I will definitely put a link to that in the show notes. Do you still have a connection to the deaf community today?
Only in the form of personal friendships that I've maintained. I'm not formally doing any work in that world right now, but I'm still friends with Taraline after all these years. And my most recent roommate was also a deaf man, so we have that connection too.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay. And then, I mean, we could spend this entire podcast talking about your education. Then you were a Fulbright scholar, and I think you were in Ireland. So tell us what led you there, what you did, and how long that process was.
The Fulbright opportunity was one of those once in a lifetime opportunities. There was, at the time that I was finishing my master's, money specifically allocated for a Fulbright scholar in deaf studies in a few countries in the world. And it's usually Fulbright, it's open. There's not earmarked funds for particular programs. So you apply and, you're going to be reviewed against everyone else applying. But because there was this fund for deaf studies, it meant I had a really good shot at winning those funds. And I think the countries that it was available for were Vietnam, maybe Italy, and Ireland. So in any of those countries, I would have to learn a new sign language. But in Vietnam, I would need either really great French or Vietnamese. And in Italy, I would obviously need Italian. And in Ireland, I could get by on American English, more or less. So that was the place that I could apply for and say, make this case that I learned American Sign Language. I can learn Irish Sign Language. It's totally fine to give this grant to somebody who speaks zero Irish Sign Language. I'll get there, I'll pick it up, and then I'll do my project, which was a series of ethnographic interviews with deaf mothers about their experiences with maternity care, which mostly were awful. That's the summary of that research. And I was doing it so that they had something codified that they could point to and say, this is real data, instead of this is kind of hearsay, anecdotal evidence that we're all getting the short end of the stick when we go to the hospital to, enter labor or whatnot, or even just get pregnant and go through prenatal care. So I designed the project kind of in concert and in contact with several people in the Irish deaf community and at Trinity College in the deaf studies program around something that sounded like it would actually fit a need that they had, rather than just come up with something totally on my own that might be completely irrelevant to them. And so the Irish Deaf Society did, in the end, take my research and translate it into ISL and make a DVD version in Irish Sign Language to make the research accessible to the deaf community, which was a high priority of mine. And I hope that it's done some good in the interceding years. I don't know, because I am not in touch with anyone from Ireland at this point, but that's what I did there.
And how long was that process?
2 semesters, basically, 10-month program.
Okay. So you lived in Dublin.
I lived in Dublin. Yeah. And I will say this was really interesting. I got there and then I was really quickly disabused of the idea that actually anybody wanted me there. They kind of said, well, you're not Irish, you're not deaf, and you're not a mother, so we don't want to talk to you about this. and I had to get people to interview with me basically in secret. Like they would all say, I'll interview, but don't tell so-and-so that I'm talking to you. And it wasn't until I presented my findings back at the end of the entire year in a public lecture, and everyone from the community came. And then they kind of went, oh, now we trust you. And then I left,
Right. Well, I'm sure aside from hopefully that research producing some good, I'm sure you learned a lot from that process too, in terms of getting people to trust you and the struggle that can sometimes be.
Yeah. Yeah. And being really clear on what my motivation is for something.
Yeah.
And being able to communicate that.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So, and I guess one other story, and then I promise, going to get into Father.Mother.God. How did you decide to start this scribe work? I often ask people what led you to sort of what you're currently doing. And I think your story is very layered and it makes a lot of sense to me, and especially this autobiographical work. But you made some decision, like, I would like to listen to other people and memorialize what they're saying. How did you decide to do that?
The short answer is I can blame my little brother. The longer answer is, and it still starts with him, honestly, is I hadn't heard of it as a thing until my brother mentioned it to me, and he had done some work in a setting where they had scribes. And he just called me up and he said, I know what you should be doing. And he described it to me, and I went, yeah, I have the skill set for that. That sounds cool. And then I went back to what I was already kind of doing. I looked up a few images of people doing it. It looked intimidating because they were good at it. And I hadn't drawn in so many years. And I just went back to my desk job. And then I was at a conference, it was South by Southwest actually, and saw scribes in the keynote sessions doing it live. And I realized the hardest part of this job is listening. And I'm a really good listener. I've trained in it in my meditation work and my contemplative work, and in how I've learned to analyze things and take them apart and hear the big picture and find the main points. And the fact that I spent so much time writing poetry and studying poetry, just for all of these reasons, I knew that I could listen. And that if I was willing to draw badly in front of people, I could learn while doing the rest of it. And so I just started drawing in my sketchbook, and then drawing on flip charts, and then drawing on big sheets of butcher paper, and at my day job in our meetings. And I would just practice, and they went for it. They loved it because it was something new and interesting, even though it was all kind of awful looking. And then I got the advice from someone, you need to contact IFEP, the International Forum of Visual Practitioners. And that's basically our professional society. And they have a conference every year, and you should go. And that's where you'll meet everyone who does this, and you'll learn whatever you need to learn about next steps. That was in 2015. And I got online and looked at IFEP, and it turned out that their 2015 conference was going to be in Austin, Texas, where I lived.
Oh.
So that made it really easy to go. I, scrounged up all my nonprofit dollars and bought myself my admission to this big kind of conference. And I rode my bicycle over to it every day. And I found people who were willing to mentor me and give me support, and took a 101 kind of crash course the days before the conference started, pre-conference workshop. And then I just started trying to do it as much as possible. My initial idea in terms of transitioning to it as a job was that I would taper down my existing day job to maybe half time, and start to try and slowly build up a business with a few clients, and have this nice gradual interchange between one career and the other. What ended up happening was my dad took his life. I was incapable of functioning. I took a leave of absence from my job, didn't go back to it, and then realized I was absolutely not going to look for any other job that I knew I didn't want and try and get hired in the state that I was in. And so I was going to build my scribing business from scratch, starting from this place of very, very complex grief, and just go from there. So that's what actually happened.
Okay. And we're obviously going to talk about your father and your parents. So before we dive into the substance of the webcomic, Father.Mother.God, can you talk a little bit about how it came to be and who's sponsoring it?
Yeah, this is a little bit similar to the Fulbright, where it's kind of, I see an opportunity come up and I realize this opportunity matches what I am able to do, and let me build something that fits it, that I might not necessarily have had the gumption to do just on my own. There's a initiative called the Jewish Writers Initiative, that started off funding storytellers in the script writing space with a script writing lab, and then expanded a couple years ago to digital storytelling, by which they mean any platform essentially besides long form film. So podcast, social, kind of serial animation on or video on YouTube or on social channels, and webtoons, graphic, graphic online graphic novels, and animations, short kind of comic animations. So all that kind of stuff. And I looked at everything that was considered a digital form of storytelling under that rubric, and I said, I've never done any of those, but webcomic I could do. I think I could write a comic. I'm a scribe. I can translate from that. And I've always wanted to write a comic, so why not now? And then I think it was just a no-brainer that it would be autobiographical, and it would be about my journey with Judaism. And then naturally that would include the stories of my parents, and it would bring in all these themes that are just the themes of my life, and put them neatly into one package. So I in my sukkah during Sukkot last fall, I just camped out with my laptop writing my application to the Digital Storytellers Lab of this idea I had for this comic, and had an interview with them, and then was offered a spot in the fellowship. So the project is funded by Maimonides Fund. That's where the actual dollars are coming from. But the Digital Storytellers Lab is the cohort itself.
And it's a year-long endeavor.
It's a year-long fellowship. There are 15 of us, I think, in the cohort. And so during that year, we have obviously the financial support of the grant, but also the support of one another as peers and as network building humans. And so we do a lot of workshopping ideas with one another as needed. Everybody kind of has different needs. And then we also have benefits like mentor hours with professionals in various parts of the field, ranging from rabbis to PR experts and anything in between. So we get a lot of one-on-one time with folks that we might not otherwise have access to, because they're kind of being subsidized to give us their time.
Yeah, that's so cool. And for actually creating the webcomic, you were saying that you're using your skills from when you were young of sort of copying photographs, for example. So are you making a physical piece of art and then somehow making it digital?
I'm drawing everything digitally.
Okay.
So nothing exists on paper. I think I only even printed out a few panels of it once on paper to mail to somebody. So it literally doesn't exist in the physical world yet. It's a totally digital universe.
Okay. That is so cool. So the first episode of the webcomic is titled Bereshith. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Bereshith, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Bereshith.
It's Hebrew for Genesis, in the beginning.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's the first word of the Torah and the Bible, and connotes the beginning of your story as well. You declare in this first episode, we don't always get to choose how we come into this world. And also, with respect to a current artistic depiction of yourself, that there is light and also darkness, and that this story, your story, is about both, and grief and praise, fear and hope, and right and wrong. And you give us some insight in this first chapter into your gender experience. You have a little, like in quotations, it's a girl, that's debatable. And then with respect to your father, you note a vacancy of the store that he owned and ran when you were growing up. I don't know if that's in upstate New York, or you can tell us, now being vacant, like physically vacant, but also how fitting that was as he became vacant and absent. So maybe we can start with your father first. You've already mentioned that your father took his own life. Mm-hmm. You shared with me and also on your site that you chose May 7th as the date to launch your webcomic, which was the date that your father took his life. I don't know what year that was, but you can share that with us. You also referenced in the webcomic that you lost your mother to suicide after your father's suicide. And we can talk about your mother later, but maybe we can just start with your father.
Sure. So my he died in 2016. but we had been estranged, and this comes out in episode 6 a little bit more, the estrangement piece, which is not online yet, but it's written. We were estranged for almost 2 years when he died. So there was the sense of vacancy and absence was kind of growing even while he was alive because of this distance between us that grew. When I think of that vacancy, I think of Dad alive with that inaccessibility, even more than in his passing. His store was in Queens. It was in Jamaica Estates. And it was his father's store first. I think it was called Associated Foods. And then he sold it to my dad. And my dad, there was a fire, I think, in the store at some point, and it had to get reconstructed in part. And so that's when he renamed it Phoenix Foods. But that store was a spot where I did a lot of playing and hanging out and visiting as a small child. So until I was 9 and we moved away, that store was kind of this magical place I would get to go to. And the delivery van, was this cool vehicle to get to climb inside. And this is before, Favor and Bite Squad and all the rest of this. Nobody was delivering groceries back then, but Dad would deliver groceries. So the store had this kind of Garden of Eden quality that when we left the store is when things sort of started tanking family wise.
So you had been estranged from your father for a couple of years. He commits suicide. And then you said, you were just enveloped in grief, which seems very natural. And maybe that grief was even deeper because of the estrangement. And you say in this first episode, this was in a later chapter, you say the trauma, it was in our blood. So I don't know what you're willing to share about sort of the experience of his passing. And then, of course, you had to deal with that with your mother as well, which was years later, I believe.
Mm-hmm. But Mom passed in 2022.
Okay. So, and then you said you took a leave of absence from your work and then you started your scribing business. You were already obviously well on your way to the scribing business, but I'm guessing that your father's passing and the grief that you were feeling gave you in some ways this break to take this risk, maybe throw yourself into it.
Yeah. So when Dad took his life, first of all, I'll just say about the circumstances of his passing were concealed from us initially. And so we had this suspicion that he'd taken his life, but we didn't know for certain until 2 months later when we finally got a police report confirming that it was a suicide. And so there was just that kind of added this extra gauze of shame and misinformation in the family that, around almost believing what did or didn't happen. That made the grief really complicated for us. I have 2 brothers. So for us 3 kids, to say, well, Dad took his life and have someone say, that's not what happened. And it's like, well, actually, you're totally wrong. I shouldn't have to fight you on this. Let me show you the details of the autopsy. Should not be a necessary part of a conversation about your parents passing. But he was never the one who we thought would do a thing like this. He was definitely depressed and distant and didn't deal with his emotions, but we didn't understand, I think, the depth of that. And then in the years leading up to his death, his estrangement wasn't just with me, it was both of my brothers as well. So none of us had firsthand experience of what he was going through, and none of us could see how bad it was. All we would get was this secondary information, like a cousin would say, oh, I saw your dad and, he seemed great. And I asked about you guys and he just said, yeah, I don't know what's going on, or something like that made it clear to us that he was absent from himself, because he would never have been like that. He was such a supportive father when he was present. Mm-hmm. I lived with him by myself after I got out of the mental hospital. Tez lived with him by himself after Henry and I were both in college. And, he did everything he could to champion and support us in those years when he was single parenting. And we had a very close relationship until we didn't. And so we kind of knew it was bad, but didn't know how bad it was. And when he died, we all just looked at each other and went, wrong parent. Because mom, on the other hand, had been talking about how she was eventually going to kill herself for years. And so that we were waiting for, in a sense. It was kind of a this will inevitably occur kind of idea that just became a fact of our reality.
Yeah.
One day mom will take her life. And with that, it was, wait a minute, wrong parent just did this here. What's going on?
Yeah. Did he leave a note or any explanations, or do you have any more answers now than you did then?
Not really. He didn't leave a note. Our mom did leave a note, and that you see that in the third episode of the comic, a part of that note. But Dad didn't leave a note. He chose Mother's Day weekend as the weekend that he died. I won't say that he chose it like predetermined, picked it out on the calendar, but that's the weekend that it happened, which felt a little bit even more intense, because now it feels like there's 2 death anniversaries of him each year. There's Mother's Day and then there's May 7th. They're not always the same day. He left a Mother's Day card for his second wife because it was Mother's Day, but he didn't leave a note of any kind. So there wasn't anything that we could piece together except for what we as kids knew to be true, that no one believed us that he was in crisis.
Yeah.
They just kind of didn't understand the estrangement, and we didn't have access to him. We had tried to reason with him, and it failed. We essentially had tried to stage an intervention and say, hey, Dad, this is really going off the rails here. You're not acting the way you want to, and you told us to tell you if you ever start behaving like this, and we're telling you. And he just wouldn't have it. So there was a lot of anger at him that I had to work through, which has taken years and years and years. It's been 7, 8 years now since he passed. And I think it's only in the writing of this webcomic that anger is finally starting to shift into something softer, and that his love is finally starting to feel in some ways accessible to me again, where before it hadn't. There wasn't some magic moment where he died and then I felt his unconditional love. That did not occur. He died and he still felt absent. Whereas when my mom passed, I could feel a sense of love from her, because I knew that she was doing it as a last resort, and that she didn't want to hurt us, and that she did, she loved us so actively in the ways that she was capable of. And I could feel her well wishes. Whereas with Dad, it just felt like an absolute absence. And it's only in recent months in this webcomic process that I'm literally writing through and drawing through and touching into memories of the past in a way where I'm getting past the anger into something else, and into, even in some cases, a sense of forgiveness, which is like a long time in coming, because it's heavy to carry around anger like that.
It's a lot to carry. Yeah. I don't know very much about suicide. I know one person, a friend of my older sister's, who committed suicide when we were young. And have you worked with like a grief community in the suicide? I'm sure there's a strong community there. And I know, like, you read about people, anger seems like a very normal feeling. Like, how could you do this to me? Leave me. And then I also have heard, like, you have to think about what they were feeling to get in a place where they actually took the action to do it, and the compassion and, the love of just, you tried to help while he was alive, but he wasn't able, for whatever reason, to take your help. So have you worked with this suicide, like a grief community, and has that been helpful? Because, and maybe it's a journey, because you're saying the webcomic is really finally giving you some sense of peace and feeling his love again. And it's been years.
Yeah, I did. There's an amazing nonprofit in Austin, Texas called the Christie Center that offers bereavement support groups sorted by the type of loss.
Okay.
So there's a support group if you've lost a child. There's a support group if you've lost someone to violent crime. There's a support group if you've lost someone, to overdose, unintentional there's a support group for if you've lost someone to suicide specifically. So I went weekly to that. And the format is actually kind of a lot like a 12-step meeting. People share, there's no crosstalk, and you say the serenity prayer at the end. And it was a space where what they said to us was, you tell your story over and over again, because that's the only thing that will normalize it for you. And so we would go week after week, and, we'd get to know one another. And one of my closest friends in the world now is somebody who I met in that group who actually turned out to be a neighbor of mine. And she had also lost her father to suicide. And I could still call another person from that group who I haven't seen in years, and she'd answer the phone, and we'd have a supportive conversation because we understand what it's like to lose someone that way. So I can't imagine what that first year or so of grieving would have been like without the Christie Center support groups. At the same time, it's really hard to get yourself off the couch to go to a group to talk about how your parent killed themselves and listen to other people talk about how their family members killed themselves. And so more often than not, especially I would say as time went on, I would just get drunk in order to be willing to go. So there was a level in which it was helping, but there was another level in which I was not getting to the bottom of my feelings because I was using drugs and alcohol to cope with those feelings.
And so I don't think you've kind of intimated your journey with drugs and alcohol and mental health, but I don't think you've done yet a chapter on that. And I'm not sure if you're going to. But do you want to talk about your process for how you became sober? And then was it only after you became sober that you were really able to address your grief properly, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. When I got sober, which was November of 2021, what had happened was I'd stopped drinking already a couple years prior, because I figured out how bad it was for me. And I thought, if I stop drinking on my own, that proves I'm not an alcoholic, nothing like anyone else in my family. But I was still doing other drugs. And so I basically just did a switcheroo. I didn't stop substances. I just stopped alcohol and thought, that checks that box. I'm not an alcoholic. I'm fine. Don't have to look at the rest of this. And then I would just use something else to check out when I needed to check out, which I thought was a lot of the time. In November 2021, what happened was I also walked out of my marriage, and that was a relationship of 12 years. And when I walked out of the marriage, I was a little bit shell-shocked because it was an unplanned move that just happened in a moment. And then I went, oh, I think I just left. And in the 2 weeks that followed, I was doing a lot of outreach calls to people, trying to understand what I had done and what I was doing and what was going on. And one person suggested to me, you didn't come up with these patterns in your marriage from nowhere, not either of you. Why don't you try going to an Al-Anon meeting? Look at your parents and your grandparents and your aunts and your uncles. Why don't you try going to an Al-Anon meeting? And so I went to one, and I said, nice people, wrong medicine. And then I found Adult Children of Alcoholics, which is an amazing group. And I immediately felt like I fit right in. I found the queer rooms. And so I'm talking to people who basically grew up as third culture kids in our own homes. And there's some kind of addiction or mental illness or dysfunction in the home as well. And so I felt like for the first time in my life, I'm in a space where I don't have to translate my experience to anybody. And so I said, I definitely need to work this program. And then I had one more outreach call with someone who suggested to me that I check out AA also. And so I went, so I was kind of one by one going through all the different, and there's been more since then, all the different 12-step groups that I can, until I found myself able to admit, I am an alcoholic. I am really messed up. These are all the reasons that I drank and that I drugged. And this is how my emotional state works and how I deal with it. And I need help. And so I started working recovery programs in that November in a couple different fellowships. And that first anniversary of my dad's passing that I was sober for is when I realized, oh, yeah, I haven't felt this 100% any of these years, because I've been checked out in one way or another for all of it. Even when I thought I was doing my due diligence to attend to my feelings, they were still coated with a veneer of something. And doing the childhood kind of reclamation work that comes in adult children of alcoholics also, and the reparenting work that happens, and identifying what my inner child needs and did or didn't receive, and all of those kind of elements together started creating more of a space for me to grieve, and dealing with the amends process, which is where you own your actions and perceptions and your words, everything on your side of the street, regardless of what the other person did. You take responsibility for that and offer your regrets for it and your willingness to change. And so I wrote countless letters to my dad, really trying to process through that. But then I would do the steps again in another program and get to that step and write my dad another letter and find the old letter, and they would be almost verbatim the same. And I would realize, oh, I've done this before, but I'm still stuck on something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the processes that are happening now with drawing my life that's something that I was stuck on that are moving it.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing all of that. In the third chapter of Father.Mother.God, which its title is "And God Said Play," you delve into finding yourself in a new name and using she, they pronouns. And I know from our communications that gender expression and queerness are very important to you, and I definitely want to spend some time on that. And on that subject, in a prior episode, and I don't know if you've listened to this with Dillian Williamson, who's the principal designer at Amatan, they talk about gender being like the stars. And I think borrowed that concept from Alok Vedmanan. And I really, really love this concept that, okay, you can have one star that's a male star and one star that's a female star. And then you have every other star in the universe, which is like some combination. And I think we had a really interesting discussion, and Dylan, was saying like we should all look at our own gender expression, because we're sort of taught when we're young, like you're a boy or you're a girl and you should like this or you should like that. But the truth is, I think that we're all a melding of different aspects. So in any event, I do want to talk about that. But you also mentioned in this episode that you legally changing your name to Play. And like many things, and I've said this before, like you note that this was given to you, like you kind of intimate God gave it to you. And I want to get into that, but that it wasn't your choice really. Like this was given to you. And then you also note your mother's struggle with your name change. And you say, this was not our first tussle at the sight of my body. And then you also address your mother's suicide with a note dated July 25th, 2022, which I'm not sure if that's the precise date.
That's her suicide date, yeah.
Okay. So there's a lot there, but maybe we can just, following on the discussion of your father's suicide, just talk about your mother's a little bit. I want to honor her as well. And you noted that you and your brothers felt like this maybe was more like she had talked about it. And I don't know if that was depression. I mean, there's a lot of discussion now, which I think I would like to do a whole episode on with somebody who's an expert in the area of assisted dying. And that can be for a lot of different reasons. It could be pain from a terminal illness. It can be just, you're going to die of a terminal illness, or I'm sure it could also be like just heavy depression. So I don't know, where your mom fell in all of that, or what you're willing to share.
Yeah, she definitely had really, really strong depression. She had substance use patterns, and she came from that from her family too. And she was an adult child of alcoholics. So her and her sisters grew up in what was, from everything I've heard, an incredibly violent household with a lot of physical and emotional and verbal and sexual abuse. So that trauma imprint was something that she never could come out from underneath. She knew how to survive, but she never got to a place where she could thrive. And so that effort of surviving, I think, just took its toll. And there were times when she would lose hope and give up and attempt to take her life. And then she would, usually by overdosing, and then she would wake up a few days later and have not died and have run the risk of really impairing her faculties. And we had to, at a certain point, say to her, Mom, you can't keep trying to kill yourself, because you're going to end up incapacitated and you're going to end up in a situation that we know you don't want, which is to be dependent on someone else to take care of you, or not able to live independently anymore. And so you either have to do this for real or not do it at all, but you can't do this in between trying thing anymore, which is a pretty messed up conversation to have with a parent. I mean, she had this really romantic idea that when she took her life, we could all be together and we could all be around her. And we had to kind of explain to her, like, that's going to look really suspicious, Mom. We can't actually do that. We can't all be with you while you kill yourself. It won't be okay, as much as we know you would want that. And so, her dying alone was exactly what she didn't want, but it was the only way that she could do what she sometimes wanted, which was to take her life. The hard part with Mom with that was the years of her talking about it and trying it and wondering if she was okay when she would kind of go dark for a few days and then find out what had happened. And the emotional toll of that was, and her basically wanting to ask our permission for her to take her life, and us having to figure out how to say, Mom, it's your choice what you do.
Right.
And when she actually died, I mean, the difference between my two parents' deaths is when my dad died and we found out it was a suicide, my response was 3 words: let's do drugs. That was literally my answer to Dad took his life. When my aunt called and told me that my mom had died, my response was to call my sponsor. And, it was like a completely sober response. And to go to a meeting and to go to another meeting and another meeting and another meeting and to work a whole new program and start my steps all over again right then on the spot, so that I could make it through that grief in a way that was totally sober and staying present to it. So they were completely different losses.
And it sounds like, and maybe it's a result of the relationship that you had with your mom versus your dad at the time that they took their lives, or maybe it's a result of you being sober when your mom took her life. But it seems like you have healed faster, or were more able to connect with your grief with your mom's death than your father's. Is that true? And if it is true, have you thought about why you think that is?
I think it's because it was cleaner energetically. She was having memory issues. She was starting to have signs of dementia. Depending on the day that you caught her on, it could be really severe. She was forgetting. I remember the last time she came to visit my brother and sister-in-law, and there are a lot of doors on the first floor of their house, and she would come out the doors and forget what was behind them each and have to check to find the bathroom or find her bedroom again, which is, that's a pretty high level of not tracking. And she's an incredibly smart woman. I mean, she was a social worker, and she did her associates and her bachelor's and her MSW all while I was in, college and beyond. She did all that later in life after she raised us. So for her to be having issues like that and leaving the oven on overnight and doing those kinds of things, she was really slipping. And all that to be said, she and I had the closest connection that we'd ever had in the last couple years of her life. We'd reconciled after a period of no contact, which followed a suicide kind of cry for help that I put me over the edge. And I said to my brothers, I'm stepping back. And we didn't talk for about 9 months. And then we rebuilt our relationship, which, this is something that hasn't come into the comic yet, and I hope it does, but I don't know when or if it will, is we were both, there are hints of it actually. We're both birders. And so that there's, the birds figure really strongly in the episode that's about her. But we went on a trip together to Mexico and we were birding together. And after that trip, it was the first time we saw each other in this time, and we were both pretty apprehensive about it. Originally, she wasn't supposed to even be on the trip. It was me and my brother and our partners. And then he said, "Oh, I invited Mom." And I was so ready to cancel my flight. And then something said, "Just hold on." And that was December of 2019. So it was the last holiday vacation we ever could have had anyway because of COVID and then her ending her life pretty much. And then after the trip, I started writing her postcards because it felt like a safe way to reestablish connection. It wasn't as threatening as a phone conversation, but it was still very immediate for her and she would feel loved. And so I drew watercolor pictures. I painted all the birds we saw together in Mexico, and then I just kept painting other birds, and I would mail these postcards once every couple weeks and just go through all these birds. And we rebuilt our relationship on that basis, really. And by the time she passed, we were like really getting to be friends. So her loss was cleaner. There's more that I lost, I think, than if she had died sooner. But that was better also.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening. It helps us reach more people who just might need these conversations. If you have ideas for future guests or have feedback, you can reach out to us by visiting onthetablewithashley.com, linked in the show notes. On the Table with Ashley is presented by our elevated everyday home brand, Amatond, which you can find at amatond.com. That's AMEATENDRE.com. You can follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Amatond. And you can learn more about products related to the Death and Dying series at amatond.com. Thanks for listening.